called CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, that I suspect many of you have heard about or are familiar with. But that's the process of doing an environmental impact report, or EIR, for a proposed development project, which is part of the decision-making process that a city or a local government agency goes through in deciding to approve or not approve a proposed project. There's also work in what is called entitlements, and that's basically the legal ability of a property owner to develop a property based on the particular land uses that they want to develop. And that is often an extensive and an expensive process for a property owner to get a property zoned and entitled for the development project that they're pursuing. And there are consultants that specifically support that process, getting a project through the city or county that it's being approved by. And that's often handled by a law firm because it does involve legal work. And so then the last thing I'll mention are economic consultants. And I've highlighted that in yellow because that's basically what I know about and what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So all these other things are development services related. Our firm works with these other types of organizations a lot as part of a team, but those are not really my those are not really my areas of expertise, and I'm going to talk to you mostly about the economic aspects of development services. Okay, so just a few of the things that our company does, and I would divide our services into two broad categories. The first I would describe as services related to real estate or community development. And then on the other half of this page, I've got services related to local economic development. And I'll describe a little bit about what the differences are. Those are two closely related areas, but there are some distinctions. So when we talk about real estate, we're talking about planning either individual development projects or planning an overall area, part of a city or even a full city in terms of the types of land uses that a community wants to see developed in their area. And so the services that we would provide as it relates to real estate development or community development would be real estate market forecasts. In other words, what is the likely opportunity for different types of development in a city or in a region based on projected economic trends. And those types of trends might include looking at demographics, population growth, the types of businesses that are likely to locate in an area, and how does that translate to demand for new development for specific land uses. And so we might describe that as a market demand study, where the developer or property owner might want to look at a piece of property and say, is there a market here to do housing or retail or office or some other land use? And we would do a specific market study to see if there's going to be demand for that type of a development. And if so, what's the time frame? Sometimes there's not immediate demand, but we might say within a couple of years there would be demand to support this project. Another part of the pre-development financial or feasibility analysis would be what is called a pro forma financial analysis. And you may have had some experience about this in your classes, but basically it's looking at, prior to development, doing a forecast of how much is it going to cost to develop this project. Once it's up and running, what is it going to cost to operate it? And then what are the revenues going to be to the developer from either selling the property once it's developed or managing it long-term and deriving revenue from leasing the facilities. And so we will essentially do a cash flow projection. That's what the pro forma financial analysis really is a cash flow projection to look at the long-term revenues and costs that would come to a developer from developing a particular project. These are sometimes described as project feasibility studies. We're looking at both what is the demand for a project in terms of the market conditions And once we've determined that there's demand for it, can it be built in a way that is financially feasible to the developer based on the land cost, the construction cost, and their anticipated revenue flows from either selling or leasing the facilities. Sometimes we do what's called a highest and best use analysis. And that would be if someone had a property, say several hundred acres that they wanted to develop, but they weren't exactly sure what the best opportunity might be. And they might say, can you do a highest and best use analysis where we look at a range of possible land uses? So we might say, well, what would happen if you built housing here, or retail, or offices, or industrial, or some other type of a use, and evaluate, okay, is there demand for any of these activities? How soon would there be demand for any of those types of activities? And if you do that, what value would that have to the developer in terms of the land value that it would support from the cash flow from those types of development? And after going through that process, and we could say, well, we believe that the highest and best use of this property would be, for example, housing based on current market conditions. Or we might say, well, if you hold off for a while in developing it, there's not immediate demand for some other land use, but ultimately that would generate a higher land value than the things that there are immediate demand for. So it's just a process of helping the landowner to decide what they might be best positioned to do with a particular property. We also are asked sometimes by developers to provide an impact study that shows what the economic impacts of their project would be once it's developed. And there are several different categories of impacts that we look at. One would be the broader economic impact. So for example, if they're building a project that would have industrial buildings, that might create new jobs, for example, in manufacturing. So they might want to look at how many jobs would there be in this project once it's built, and how would that contribute to the local economy? A special kind of impact study is called a fiscal impact analysis, and that looks at how a project would impact the local government, in most cases the city, the financial impacts to the city. So if you take a new housing development, for example, that project is going to generate new revenues to the city in the form of property taxes, sometimes sales taxes and other revenues that cities collect. But it's also going to generate new costs to the city because the city will have to provide services to the residents of that project. So things like police protection, fire protection, parks, libraries, all these services that cities provide. And we're asked to look at what are the costs of those services going to be over time. And so then we can compare, well, is this project going to generate more revenues or more costs, so that we can see is it going to have a net positive or negative impact on the city's finances. And I mentioned that we do these types of studies for developers. They usually don't do them just because they want to, but they're required to do that by the city as part of their approval process. So the city will say, you need to get a consultant to evaluate this project and let us know what the impacts will be to our community. Sometimes we do those studies directly for the developers. Other cases, the cities prefer to be the manager of the project, so they will hire us to do that for a project that's coming through their approval process. We also work with cities to develop land use plans for larger areas. So not just a specific piece of property or a specific project, but what are called specific plans, which is basically a plan for a neighborhood or a specific part of a city, or sometimes even working on what are called general plans. And I suspect you've learned about this.
That makes sense. With more technology, the thing started.
And so the general plans are a citywide land use plan, and those are usually done by a big team of consultants. So a planning firm, an environmental firm, people looking at traffic and other infrastructure. And we are part of that team, and we're essentially being asked to provide a long-range market forecast for that city to identify the types of development that they might have demand for, and then the planning team can use that as a basis for planning what their zoning will be and what types of land uses they will accommodate in the future. Also, as I mentioned, projects often require an environmental impact report, and those again are done by teams of consultants with different disciplines looking at issues like traffic, air quality, biological resources, and other environmental issues. And so we don't do all of that, but we do parts of it, because sometimes that fiscal impact analysis that I mentioned would be part of an environmental impact analysis, or sometimes there are other economic and financial issues that cities want to look at as part of the environmental process. We also work with cities on preparing plans for financing infrastructure. So again, if you think of development services as all the stuff that goes on in the background before someone begins to construct a project, one of the key considerations is there adequate infrastructure in terms of roads and water and sewer and other physical infrastructure to serve that project. And in some cases, cities need to have ways of financing that because it's expensive, but it's also potentially benefits the city because it allows for future development. So we work with cities to identify different mechanisms for financing future infrastructure improvements. The last thing I'll mention under the area of real estate development are redevelopment strategies. And so these are areas in cities that have already been developed, but maybe the properties have gotten older or becoming blighted, and the city's looking for ways to adopt policies that will encourage reuse or redevelopment of those properties. And you can think of a good example that we see a lot of now is that with the change in the retail industry, there are more and more shopping centers that are under distress. They're losing their tenants. More people are shopping online, so there's just less need for large shopping centers. And cities are starting to look at these, as well as private property owners, with the question, what can we do now with this property to improve its viability for retail, or possibly to transition it to other land uses like housing or industrial or other types of things besides retail. And a lot of that, of course, involves a market analysis and looking at the costs of redeveloping it. So that would be a financial analysis. So a lot of the skills that we use to look at a new project can also be applied to identify opportunities as well as challenges related to redevelopment of older properties. I'll just talk briefly about the economic development side. And this work is done almost entirely for public sector clients like cities and counties. And this is not at the site-specific level of getting a particular real estate or land use project approved or planned, but is typically focused on what are the larger drivers in our local economy that are actually creating demand for those land uses and creating a vibrant economy in terms of employment opportunities for residents. So a lot of cities devote staff and time to marketing themselves to attract businesses essentially that create jobs and create tax revenue for their communities. And often this will be done as part of a process called economic development strategic planning, where we will look at a strategy for business retention, expansion, and attraction. And again, a lot of cities work with their local businesses to make sure that they're healthy and growing in their communities. And they also, in many cases, cities will target firms that aren't in their community and try to attract them to come and create jobs locally. And as part of that, we will do target industry studies, looking at the types of industries that a particular community is well positioned to attract so that they can market their opportunities to industries that are likely to be successful in attracting. And that's what I would describe as an economic development marketing plan. A lot of times we're also looking at the workforce in a community because that has a lot to do with the types of firms that would be interested in locating there. And certainly as college students, you're aware of the way that tech industries have really can transform the economy of a local community. And so lots of communities would love to have tech firms and tech industries there because they create good jobs, higher paying jobs, and also create a tax base for their community. And one of the main considerations that those firms have is, what is the workforce going to be in that community for the people that I would hire to work at this company? And so they're looking at, is the education system in that community producing the types of workers that would be good candidates for our firm? So that's part of the economic development strategic planning process. A lot of times these things involve partnerships between a city and a private developer to get a project to go through, and we help to set those up. And there's often things that are done at the local level and that are in partnership with a regional organization. So the city of Pomona, for example, might collaborate with a regional economic development organization that covers the entire San Gabriel Valley. And we help to put those together and to identify what the roles of each party would be in promoting economic development in that community or region. So I think I've alluded to this already, but just to be more specific, who are the clients that hires a company like ours? First of all, we work directly for developers, helping them to identify opportunities for their properties, to assess the feasibility of specific projects that they're considering, and also to support them in going through the permitting and approval process with the city or county where they're located. And as I mentioned, sometimes when we're doing a fiscal impact study or other types of environmental impact work, that is done for a developer, but it's to support the required steps that they need to go through to get approval with the city or county. We do some work for state and federal agencies, not as much as we do at the local level, but we've done, for example, housing market appraisals for the federal government, and some work on citing major institutional facilities like prisons for the state of California. And a lot of the same considerations come into play. We're just kind of focusing, instead of focusing on citing a private development project, what are the economic factors that make a location good for institutional facilities? We do often get hired by law firms because, as I mentioned, they're going through an entitlement process for a client and need to have some of these studies done to support that, to answer questions that a community or a city might have. We work with planning firms who are doing either general plans or specific plans for cities, and they need a market analysis to kind of help guide that process. We will work with them on that. And then, as I've mentioned several times, we work on environmental impact reports, and those are usually led by an environmental firm, but they will hire a firm like ours to be a subcontractor to do specific aspects of the work that relates to economics. I know that many of you are interested potentially in careers related to real estate, and as I mentioned at the beginning, I don't know about the entire real estate industry, but I do know quite a bit about the consulting side of real estate services or development services. And I wanted to encourage you to think about a career in consulting. I have, as I mentioned, I've pretty much spent my entire career, the last 32 years with the same firm and the same industry. And what has been enjoyable about it to me is that we get such a diversity of clients, a diversity of projects, and a diversity of project types, so that it's almost like I'm getting a new job every couple of months, because I'm refocusing my attention on different types of challenges. And some of those things change over time. The type of work that my company did 30 years ago has evolved from what it is, has evolved today from what it was 30 years ago, simply because the real estate market has changed. Trends have changed in terms of economic development. And there's always issues like the current pandemic that kind of cause people to rethink the way they approach things, and consultants always get an opportunity to be a part of that process of making decisions and answering the questions that come up as conditions change. So one of the advantages I think about consulting is that there's a lot of flexibility to take on new types of assignments that are at kind of at the forefront of those decisions, and work with a variety of clients, a variety of partners, and in a variety of geographic settings. So I can talk more about that later, but I've found the diversity of consulting has been exciting and has kept it kind of like almost like a new career every year in a way, because we're doing different types of things as time goes on. So the types of skills that would help someone to be successful in real estate consulting, I've laid out on this slide, and I've broken it into what would be the things that you would look for as an entry-level applicant for a job in a consulting firm. What types of additional skills might you want to get by the time you're mid-career if you decide to stick with consulting on a longer-term basis? And then if you get to a long-term career and you get to the executive level, some additional skill sets that are involved there. One thing that I didn't mention a minute ago when I was kind of describing the things that I like about consulting, one thing that's also good is that it can be an entree into other types of careers. And in my case, I've just stuck with where I started, which is in consulting, but a number of people who have worked with me and in other firms like mine have started out for a few years in real estate consulting and then ventured off into other related firms or industries. And I've known a number of people who've gone straight to work for real estate developers based on the experience they've gained in our type of work. Others have gone to work for public sector agencies, in other words, working like in a city planning department or economic development department, and other types of finance and consulting positions as well. So it's kind of a good entree to other types of work, but I think you can develop a good skill set and that would be transferable to other industries and careers. So getting back to my chart, at the entry level, typically this is a job that's accessible to someone right out of college with a bachelor's degree. And I think the degree that many of you are pursuing related to real estate is great, although I would say that we don't necessarily require someone to have a background in a particular major in college. We're really looking more for the skill set than the specific types of classes that someone might have had. And the reason for that is we can train the specifics about real estate and the work that we do, but we're more successful at training someone if they've got just good fundamental skills in the areas that I've outlined here. So I would say someone to do this type of work would need to be good with numbers, and that doesn't mean you need to be a math major. We're not using advanced math, calculus, or anything like that in our work on a day-to-day basis, but we do work with spreadsheets and just basic calculations, and the ability to deal with quantitative analysis, mostly using software and simple modeling that we do is a plus. And so that would be an essential thing, is to be good with numbers. As I said, not necessarily advanced math, but just basic statistics and spreadsheets and software. Another thing that is essential is excellent writing skills. I mean, virtually everything that we do is ultimately communicated to a client in a written report. That's basically what we're selling as a work product, is a report that summarizes the analysis we've done, makes clear the conclusions that we've reached based on our study, and also makes clear the recommendations on how our client act on those conclusions based on the opportunities or issues that we've outlined. I think it's great to have a background where you've learned about how to do research, and that type of orientation is important for this, because especially at an initial entry-level job in consulting, you're basically going to be doing a lot of research. That has changed a lot since I started 32 years ago. And all of you have grown up in the era where we had most of our research can be done online. When I was first starting, we were using computers, but the internet was not something that most people had ever heard of at that point. So the type of research I did, I was literally going to government offices to look up data in big books, that stuff that now we can download basically for free in just a few minutes. So the work has shifted, and in many ways it's become easier, but it's also kind of demanded that we learn how to add value to the data that we can get from free sources and add value in terms of the way we analyze and interpret it. As I mentioned, we don't necessarily require someone to have a particular major. I happen to have a degree, a bachelor's and master's degree in economics, which of course aligns well with being an economic consultant, but it's not necessarily a requirement. I think it's helpful to have a basic understanding of economics and real estate development, but those are things that we can train on the job if we've got someone that's got those fundamental skills in working with numbers and writing and doing research. So I would say that that's, in a sense, less important than the fundamentals, but it's a plus if you have at least some knowledge or interest in those areas. And in general, I would encourage all of you to seek out careers that you have some passion about. Don't just pursue a job because it happens to align well with your major or where there might be an opportunity currently. But I think in the long term, you'll be much more successful if you pursue something that you're passionate about, because that will allow you to put the level of effort in that is needed to advance really in any career, but especially in this type of a work setting. And that relates very much to the last thing I've listed on the entry level skill set, which is a strong work ethic. Any career that you get into, initially it's going to be hard work. You're going to have to be learning about being in a full-time professional career, learning the specific skills for that particular industry or company, and just getting up to speed with meeting the demands day to day of your employer and your clients. So again, that's all the more reason that I encourage people to pursue work that they have an interest and that they're passionate in, because then it will just come naturally to put that extra effort in and to have that strong work ethic that you need to really dive in and learn the skills related to your particular job. On the other side of the chart, I've listed kind of mid-career skills. And so you could kind of expect for maybe the first 2 or 3 years in a consulting environment, you're mostly going to be working kind of behind the scenes, doing research and writing reports, probably with support from a more senior consultant that's got experience in those things. But to the degree you can be more independent, that opens up opportunities for advancement. So, first couple 3 years or so, you're going to be kind of working behind the scenes, doing research, writing reports, kind of responding to requests from other people in the organization that are more directly interfacing with clients. As you advance and let's say 3 years or so, 3 to 5 years into the career, there may be opportunities for advancement that would involve more project management, probably more of a need to be good at public presentations, potentially making presentations to clients, potentially making presentations to city councils and public hearings about a project. And all those things are skills that don't necessarily come naturally to all of us, but you'll develop those over time as you get more confident in your understanding of the technical work that you're doing. It becomes easier then to go out and present that in a public speaking situation. Tend to, at mid-career, have more direct interface with the company's clients. And of course, that requires some presentation skills and the ability to represent the firm at a very professional level. And again, not necessarily mandatory, but I think it's helpful in a consulting environment to consider additional degrees beyond a bachelor's degree at some point midway through your career. And that might be an MBA. I know people that do our kind of work that have master's degrees in planning, master's degrees focused on real estate or economics. As I mentioned, I have a master's degree in economics, which I pursued about 3 years after graduating from my bachelor's degree. I worked for 3 years and then continued with a master's degree after that. And I did that concurrently while still working with the company. And then beyond the mid-career level, if you were to kind of pursue basically becoming an owner or a partner in a consulting firm, then your skills would again shift. You potentially would have a team of people working with you to support some of the day-to-day operations, and you'd have the opportunity to focus more on managing the team, executive management, business development, which is kind of the whole other side of the consulting business. Is you need to complete work and assignments for clients, but before you can ever do that, you have to have clients and contracts to begin with, and that's a part of what I spend my time doing, is developing new clients and new customers for our services. And then a lot of those things come through partners. And I mentioned in our case, it's like law firms, environmental firms, planning firms. And I spend a lot of time kind of nurturing those relationships so that we as a partnership can be successful in pursuing new clients, new projects and contracts. And that has become, it's a very enjoyable part of the work to maintain relationships with those colleagues, but it's also a productive way to keep new types of projects and assignments coming into our business. I thought I'd talk a little bit about COVID-19 and how has it impacted real estate, number one, and how has it impacted businesses like ours who are involved with development services. And I guess I'll start by saying that a lot of this is still very much speculation. I mean, a lot of people, once the pandemic took hold and the related lockdowns and quarantines had a huge effect on our economy, a lot of people started to make predictions about how this would play out, what types of changes would be short term, and what types of things would be perhaps permanent changes in the way real estate happens and the way our economy functions. And so no one really knows how this is going to play out yet. It's too early to know, but I think we can start to make some intelligent guesses, to be honest, with what things that might happen and things that we might still need to continue to monitor, because we just don't know what's going to really happen, but we can make some initial assumptions and then track those over time and think about how that affects the work we're doing and how that affects the way our clients are planning and investing in real estate. So I think you could think of, in terms of real estate, the impacts to real estate. There's a couple of things that might happen. There might be demand shifts. In other words, there might be certain land uses that there's more demand for now and some that there's less demand for based on the current situation and what some of the more permanent effects might be. And it might also affect the locations that people choose to locate certain land uses in. And again, those might be longer term effects, but you can kind of think of, is there going to be demand for a land use? And if yes, is it going to be more or less demand? And then is that demand likely to shift to a different type of location than it did prior to the pandemic? So I thought I'd just kind of go down the list of land uses, and maybe in a minute we'll kind of open this up for discussion, because you might have some ideas on this as well. I know that you've all given a lot of thought to real estate and you're thinking about it now as it potentially affects your future careers. But I think that the answer to the question of how does COVID-19 affect real estate really is different by land use. So the first thing I've listed is housing. We know that housing has been in strong demand throughout California. Most communities in California have a significant shortage of housing, and has created an affordability crisis with housing, so that there is basically an ongoing demand for more housing production in most communities throughout the state. So we have not, in our experience, seen a slowdown in developer interest in housing or city interest in housing. It seems to be continuing strongly right through this pandemic. We would think, though, that this might longer term cause people to rethink the types of projects, the types of housing construction types, as well as the locations that people would prefer to live. One of the obvious trends that we're seeing is a rise in telecommuting, which has been kind of forced on us by the need to stay at home more. But we're starting to ask, are there potentially benefits to this that would make that telecommuting trend a more permanent part of our economy? And if so, that could really shift the way people think about housing. It's maybe no longer essential to be located in a city close to where your job is, but you can telecommute and therefore can live potentially anywhere and work at a job that might be far away where you only occasionally need to go and physically meet with someone at your workplace. So that might shift the types of the locations where housing is important, and it might shift the types of buildings that people would look for housing. In other words, might there be a demand for houses that have extra rooms for home offices compared to what we see now? Retail and restaurant. This has been a hugely impacted sector in places like California, where the lockdown restrictions have been significant. Certainly, we're all familiar with the restaurants that have had to initially close and then reopen with takeout options and limited in-house dining. And I know those conditions vary from county to county, but this has been an industry that has had significant impacts. And to the extent that there are ongoing concerns about the safety of public dining, this might have long-term consequences to the way that restaurants are planned and designed. Retail in general has been an industry that has transformed significantly over the past 10 to 20 years, primarily due to the impacts of increasing e-commerce sales. There's simply fewer and fewer brick and mortar options for shopping centers. And we suspect that the pandemic, if anything, is accelerating that trend, that retail businesses that were already marginal because of e-commerce are further under pressure and may have gone out of business because of the lockdown. And also, we see that the pandemic has encouraged a further transition to online shopping because people found it essential or more convenient to buy things online during the pandemic. And that has resulted in a further acceleration of that shift towards less brick and mortar retail. Same thing with entertainment. Things like movie theaters are obviously significantly impacted, and it's unclear at this point how they're going to continue to operate in the future and what the changes might need to be in the way those physically are designed. Hotels have been impacted because of the people's fears of traveling, and is it safe to stay in a hotel? And again, that would have implications for the way these things are designed and the locations that people would seek out for travel. Maybe more people prefer to avoid congested urban areas and feel safer in hotels that are in more remote or suburban areas. Office space. Again, this is the other side of the telecommuting equation. You've got people that are now working from home and companies deciding, well, maybe we really didn't need to spend as much money as we were on office rent. Could this be a more permanent arrangement for us? And that is potentially great news for a company that's saving money on rent, and potentially great news for a worker who doesn't have to be on the freeway commuting every day. But if you're a landlord trying to lease office space, that's potentially bad news. So that's a land use where property owners may have to think about reinventing their properties around new demand trends. Industrial space is maybe a winner in this equation because that's where e-commerce businesses tend to locate, distribution, logistics facilities that are facilitating all the e-commerce. And as that grows, demand for industrial space would tend to grow as well. And industrial is a land use that in Southern California, it's very scarce. The facilities are very scarce. So there's already kind of a demand which in many cases exceeds the supply, and this would seem to accelerate that. So we would think that, for example, shopping centers where there's less demand might be good candidates for reuse with certain types of industrial facilities. And then getting away from real estate itself, but just institutional uses and transit facilities, the locations of those may all be impacted by the way these other land uses kind of get reshuffled in terms of where people would see them locating best in terms of geographic community types. In terms of local economic development, the type of work we do has shifted, whereas there was previously a focus on attracting new businesses to a community. Most cities are now kind of in a emergency response mode where their top priority is helping the existing businesses who are there to survive and get through this immediate crisis. And that's sometimes described as business retention, retaining the businesses that a community has, assisting them with their immediate financial needs if possible, and then hopefully allowing them to continue to function in the future and to grow. All of that has implications for land use changes for communities. And that might have longer term fiscal impacts. If there are fewer shopping centers that generate sales tax, that can be a challenge for communities that rely on that sales tax for the revenue they use to support all their city services. And then again, the worker commute patterns might create opportunities for some cities, and it might create problems for other cities. If you're in a community that has a large office inventory in a downtown area where a lot of people used to commute, you're not necessarily going to have those people there anymore, and that can create challenges for those particular types of communities. So in terms of our business as a consultant, thankfully has continued to be very busy during this pandemic, and I think it's because a lot of our clients, whether they're developers or cities, are seeking responses. They're looking for help to answer these questions of what's going to happen, what are the impacts of these trends, and how do we respond to them over the long term to keep our local economies and real estate markets as healthy as possible. So I know I've talked probably longer than I had planned to, but I wanted to give you some of the background about what my experience has been as a real estate consultant. And at this point, I'm glad to open it up for questions and glad to stay on the line as long as any of you would like to have a discussion. So I want to again thank you for inviting me. It's been great to talk with you. I wish we could be together in person. Maybe someday we'll do that when conditions change, but great that you could join us today on this Zoom meeting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dale. A couple questions pertaining to the educational background and the MBA in economics. As opposed to going for the MBA in economics, would you recommend an alternative or supplemental, if there is one, for pursuing the master's degree to still provide the same level of education or exposure?
I think that it would depend on someone's particular career path. If they intended to stay in consulting for their full career, I think any of those options would probably be okay, like a master's degree in planning or an MBA with a focus on real estate would be great, or a general master's degree in economics, potentially with a focus on what's called regional economics, would all work well. I think you'll find in consulting that the specific degree is not as important as just the fact that you have a degree. I think that clients like to see that the consultants they're working with are well educated and have backgrounds that are relevant to what they're talking about. But at the end of the day, I think any of those would work. Now, if someone's more specifically interested in transitioning into a career working as a real estate developer or for a development firm, probably an MBA would be a great choice, and a good MBA program with a focus on real estate or finance would be a strong choice, or a planning background could be a good choice. But I think it depends on the individual, and I think it also depends on the program. If it's a strong program that cuts across some of these different disciplines, I think you could be well served in any case. And I just kind of, again, encourage you to pursue what interests you most, because I think you can leverage any of these degrees in a variety of careers.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Does your company offer any internships or anything like that?
We do occasionally. As I mentioned, we're a small firm, so we don't have a lot of openings, and most of the people who work with me have worked, I've got, you know, one employee that's been with me 25 years, one 20 years, another 10 years. So we don't have a lot of turnover because we're kind of a stable group. But occasionally, if someone would contact me and ask about an internship, we would be glad to try to put something together if it kind of works out well with the projects we have going on that would make sense for a student or someone just graduating to help us with. So if anyone is interested, I'd be glad to have you contact me and know that I don't necessarily have a lot of openings just because we're a small company. We don't hire a lot, but I am glad to talk with anyone who has more specific questions about careers, and, you know, where possible, put you in contact with other firms that might have openings.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. In fact, I'm gonna move the slide. This is my contact information, phone number and email, and be glad if anyone wants to contact me. Maybe it's best to email first and set up a time to talk, but always glad to talk with people who have an interest in this field and see if there's ways that I can help you.
Okay, I have one question I could ask you. Just you're analyzing California, correct?
Mostly.
Mostly.
Yeah,
Okay.
we work in other states, but we mostly work in California.
Is there a specific area or a region in California that you would say the market is just kind of hot, so to speak, to where developers kind of flock to, or something just more recently that, you know, a lot of development has been going on? Or
Well, it varies by the type of land use that we're talking about. So housing has been, you know, there's pressure throughout California, I would say, for building more housing. So the challenge with housing has not been so much a lack of demand. There seems to be plenty of demand for housing, but in many cases, it's a very challenging process to get a project approved for development within the city, because a lot of times communities don't want additional housing. They don't want additional traffic. They don't want the environmental issues that go along with housing. And in many cases, communities don't want higher density housing, which is what a lot of the demand is for right now. So housing is, I think, is an opportunity, but that's not to say that it's you know, an easy process for a developer to do housing development. Not so much that there's a lack of demand for their product, but it's just a long and extensive and expensive process in many cases to get a project through the entitlement process with a city. And I don't mean that to bash the cities. They have legitimate reasons for being careful about the projects that they approve, but it's a challenge that communities are facing throughout California. The other land use I mentioned is kind of being strong in demand right now is industrial, and the Inland Empire area just east of where you guys are is known nationally to be a hotspot for this. I'm sure many of you are familiar with all the industrial buildings near the intersection of the 10 and 15 freeways in Ontario, and that has been a huge success in terms of logistics facilities and e-commerce and distribution businesses. And Ontario has largely built out, meaning that most of their land is gone now because they've built so many of these facilities over the last couple of decades that now developers are looking for new opportunities, places where there is still land. And so that demand has kind of shifted further to the east. The city of San Bernardino has picked up a lot of this type of use. Moreno Valley has got a huge opportunity or huge capacity for this. And so communities are looking at that as an opportunity, and certainly there seems to be opportunities from the developer side. Retail, as I've mentioned, is a challenge, and so I think you're going to see in most cases the opportunities there are going to be ways to creatively revitalize existing properties. You know, there seem to be fewer and fewer communities where there's going to be interest in building a brand new large shopping mall just because the ones that are already there are struggling and there just aren't enough tenants and shoppers for brick and mortar space to go around. So the opportunity there will be, you know, property owners that can be creative about reusing or revitalizing existing retail facilities. And same thing, I think, kind of community by community, there's demand opportunities for hotels. I don't know that I would know enough to say what communities or areas would be better for, or worse for those, but I think that in general, opportunities are kind of community specific and land use specific, which is why companies like ours have a role in helping a developer to look at a specific opportunity to see if it's feasible and makes sense as an investment.
It's all very interesting. I really appreciate your time and everything.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate all of your questions. You're asking great questions, all of you.
Does anyone have any more questions?
Well, I want to thank you all for your time and interest today, and hope that this has given you some insight about what real estate consulting is about. It's just a small piece of the pie in the overall real estate industry, but it's been an interesting opportunity for me in my career. I've enjoyed it, and would encourage any of you to consider it as an option as you're getting through your school time and looking into careers. And as I said, feel free to be in touch with me if there's any way I can answer additional questions or just talk about opportunities. I'm glad to do that with any of you.